Welcome to CSIS. I'm John Alterman, Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair, Senior Vice President, and the Director of the Middle East Program. I am delighted to welcome you to this program today to talk about a new book entitled Security Assistance in the Middle East, Challenges and the Need for Change, just recently published by Lynn Reiner Publishers. We have with us two of the editors of this volume and two of the chapter authors. One of the editors, Dr. Hicham Alaoui, the founder and director of the Hicham Alaoui Foundation, which undertakes innovative scientific research into the Middle East and North Africa. He's a scholar on comparative politics of democratization in the Middle East. Robert Springborg, a research fellow at the Italian Institute of International Affairs in Rome, and an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Professor Lindsey Benstead, associate professor of political science and the director of the Middle East Studies Center at Portland State University, and Alex Walsh, program manager for security sector reform at the Geneva Center for Security Governance. Folks, thank you very much for joining me today. Hicham and Bob, what's the argument of your book? What's the main thing you're trying to get across?
Well, if I may begin, that the main argument is essentially that security assistance is an important component. It's a legitimate component to development. It plays an important role between partners in any relationship, here being the providers of military assistance and the recipients of assistance. However, this relationship is very tricky because the recipients have essentially subverted this aid, I'm not saying illicitly or anything. I'm just saying that it's been using it for missions that have less to do with development and serving the nation or the state or their respective societies, but rather the narrow interests of their regime, meaning the coalition that's particular at power at a certain moment of time. And a result of that, when challenges come, they have shown that they are basically incapable to meet these challenges. On the other hand, the provider of this help knows the problem, but he is caught in this relationship and being unable to modify it. We show examples of this, and we pose the questions: how can this be remedied, with the understanding that it's an enormous challenge?
And where has the literature on this been, and what gap did you feel you were able to fill by writing this book?
I think the literature is there, except it should be approached differently. It should be excavated differently. Plus, as you will notice for those that read the book, that we basically solicit the participation of people that are practitioners, that are in the field and have dealt with these questions for a very long time. And the challenge of this book was putting together a group of people, but having this, as I described, this framework run through the book like a thread, so that it has coherence and that the volume has coherence. But the literature is there. It's just been the angle from which it's been treated, but also the practitioners, their background, their involvement in the MENA region, in this particular field of expertise, has been very, very key in basically helping us distill and put together this body of work.
And Bob, you've been involved putting together a lot of books. You've written a lot of books. What's been different about this experience? I mean, partly you did it through COVID, but what's been different, and how do you think the product was different because of the way you put this together?
Well, as Hicham just said, this was a huge undertaking. We have 17 contributors to this volume, and I'll wave it out here. This is over 400 pages. And so keeping the thread going, as Hicham mentioned, was a challenge, because we had practitioners from military backgrounds, we had theoreticians from civilian backgrounds, and then we had just normal garden variety academics, such as myself. And so what the basic agreement was, we went back to Hippocrates and his oath, first do no harm. the idea was, well, look, there are lots of side effects that are negative. So we wanted to identify them, but we didn't want to be overwhelmed by them. We want to say, okay, well, can we cure the patient, that is security assistance, by not just fine tuning it, as much of the literature coming from a Department of Defense sort of background tries to do. We want to try to fix the bigger problem. And so it was really that consensus around the idea of making security assistance better for both recipient and provider that really drove it. And all the authors sort of got on board. So the thread is there. And so it's not like reading 17 different people here. It's like reading one author and 17 different approaches.
And when you talk about the Hippocratic Oath and do no harm, I think at the core of a lot of that is what the book calls the democratic paradox. Can you explain to the audience what you mean by the democratic paradox in this context?
Well, simply put, it is the predominant security assistance providers, being Western countries or democracies, and the predominant recipients of security assistance, certainly in the Middle East, are authoritarian states. And as Hicham just said, there tends then to be a disjunction between principal and agent, between provider and recipient. Whereas the recipient, as an authoritarian, is seeking to use military as a primary base of the regime, even more than the military as an instrument of foreign policy. And this has not, for over 200 years, this has been the disconnect between Western security assistance and the recipients in the Middle East. And so the question becomes, can you overcome this democratic paradox? And it's a paradox that is most directly addressed in the book by Yazid Saik, who talks about defense institution building in quite a creative way.
One of the things that struck me is when we talk about security assistance in this context, there are different kinds of security assistance. One is a sort of basic foreign military sales case where there are countries with lots of money that want to buy weapons and training and other kinds of things. And then there are countries that are security partners of the United States, where the United States or European governments are providing things to these governments to try to encourage them to do things, but the governments in many cases don't have huge bank accounts and are on the receiving end rather than on the demanding end. I think as I read the book, both of those fall into the security assistance paradigm, but they're different. How should we differentiate them, and what kinds of different tools do we have in each case?
Well, in the first case, in the first case which you evoke, it's more straight out procurement, and when you have a straight out procurement, it's a commercial relationship. But even then, when there's a commercial relationship, usually there's still a cooperation component by which has to be training. There has to be the provider has to provide an infrastructure for the absorption and for the deployment of all this. So even in that situation, there is still a assistant and a development component. The situation there is harmful for both recipient and provider, but I guess less for the provider, because it nourishes what Eisenhower called the military industrial complex, and so it's another problematique. But again, with the caveat that usually the lining is very thin between the frontier between these two is very thin. But the real problem is with assistance to providers that don't come in a commercial exchange framework, and paradoxically, that's where there is where the provider has the most leverage on the recipient. However, usually, and as this book demonstrates, once you read it, he's caught in the provider is caught in a credibility trap, by which there's a collective action problem, which draws them more and more down that path in which there is no way out, where that relationship has to be reviewed. But for it to be reviewed, then the provider, the recipient comes back and says, well, if you are going to apply pressure to me, then I have to reconsider it, and I can renege on the mission that you want me to provide. And given the sensitivity of the mission, which varies, but the spectrum can go from counterterrorism to controlling immigration, given the importance and the salience.
I think we have
issues. The recipient, as you can imagine, has a lot of leverage.
we just had a bit of a connection issue, I think.
Yes. So yes, so I'm saying there is considerable leverage that the recipient has, given the salience of the issues which are now on the table and which are tied to development and to assistance issues, which can range from counterterrorism to immigration, and here within lies the paradox and the challenge in fixing this relationship.
So let me take advantage of Bob's deep expertise on Egypt, but also, an awful lot about Jordan. And it seems to me that the U.S. security relationships with both Egypt and Jordan are deeply integrated with a desire to promote Arab-Israeli peace. And where that stands is in a very different place than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, even 45 years ago with the Camp David agreement. Does that give the United States more leverage in these relationships? Should the United States seeking to use more leverage in the security relationship, or would that be a mistake because in the Egypt case, the Egyptians are engaging more actively with the Russians and the Chinese? Jordan has all sorts of internal challenges, and there's an argument to be made that the last thing you want to do is put more pressure on the Jordanians. I think a lot of Israelis would argue that. I mean, how should we think about the changing rationales for security assistance when issues like the Arab-Israeli conflict have moved into a different phase?
Well, one of the chapters in our book, namely by General Williams, makes the argument that security assistance to Egypt worked. That a primary, if not the primary objective was, John, just as you say, it was a treaty with Israel and one that would last, which it has. So it was a huge success. The same with the '94 treaty with Jordan. It has lasted. But the follow-on question you have, can you do that again? Well, first, you don't need to.
What should our security assistance relationship be now looking forward if that goes into the done column?
Yeah, and I'm going to quote to you from one of your colleagues, or former colleague, Tony Cordesman, who sets the scene for the book by talking about the contemporary Middle East and how it is a very different world than what gave rise to the security assistance we saw with Egypt and to a lesser extent with Jordan, because it came later. And he's basically arguing, as is echoed in other chapters in the book, about this transactional world that has become the Middle East. So the leverage that any particular provider has now is so much less than what it was back in the 80s when this whole process began between Washington and Cairo. So to try to use your leverage in a very direct way is to invite a breakdown of the relationship. As Hicham was just saying, you simply don't have, whatever the objective might be, whether it's broadening the Abraham Accords, whether it's trying to get Egypt to cease and desist from its close relationship with Russia, and as we just heard from the Washington Post yesterday, to stop providing rockets to Russia and instead send artillery ammunition to the Ukraine. And even that was a big deal and may have required the United States to provide a squadron of F-15s to Egypt to get that to be done. We don't know yet. We haven't heard the full story. So it's another world. And the old one, where in the Cold War you were on one side or the other, and that was it, and it was reinforced by civilian aid as well as military aid, that's all come to an end.
Let me ask a goals question. Hicham, how should we think about effectiveness versus efficiency when we're doing security assistance? Should we be caring a lot about efficiency, about creating efficient forces, or should we be looking toward effectiveness, toward ancillary goals, toward other policy aspects where security assistance is one piece? I mean, obviously, the ideal is optimizing both, but oftentimes there's a trade-off.
Well, the problem is when you look at the patterns, both have not been realized, and so I'm not so sure there's even a trade-off because given the track record is very poor, and the realization even in the United States that there was that wasn't there basically invited or was a big part in the intervention in Iraq, and that was a sobering moment after that. And the same thing happened in Afghanistan, where that was a sobering moment. So then you have the pendulum swinging in the other direction that says, well, let's abandon all that together. But that's not a solution too, as one sees. That concurrently to that, there was also a tendency, more than a tendency, a will to create auxiliary forces that would basically do what sub-actors do what states ought to be doing in the first place. And the Kurdish groups have efficiently tackled the ISIS and the Daesh challenge. But then and the Russians did the same concerning the threats they saw in Syria and so forth. Well, it was effectively done, but now we have a reality with these militias that have essentially challenging the states now, and they are threatening states with failure. So realizing all this, we've come up with a formula. It's not a formula, but the acronym DDD, 3 Ds, meaning diplomacy, democratization, and development, as a challenge, as an alternative route. But that essentially involves a top-down approach, a bottom-up approach, which was very challenging, and it even that is hard to see how we can enforce as the region becomes more and more authoritarian, and the disconnect not only between provider and recipient of change, but the disconnect within these societies, within these states, between civilians and military forces and the real holders of power in many of these cases becomes more and more difficult. That's an added layer to deal with.
So let me, if I can't bring Alex into this, you've thought a lot about policing, and the fact is that most of these states have come to think, especially after 2011, that their internal challenges are much larger than their external challenges. The U.S. often has deep discomfort with the way that a lot of these states deal with their internal challenges. What do you think? I know this isn't what your chapter in the book was about, but what do you think the U.S. should be doing to ensure that the security assistance the U.S. gives is aligned with what the U.S. government thinks appropriate threats are, and that governments use U.S. training and equipment to, in a U.S. government view, appropriately address those threats?
Well, thank you, John, for the question, and thank you for having me here. It's a very big question, and I wouldn't presume to lecture Washington on what it should or shouldn't do, but at least from my experience, so a little background on, I've been researching and working within stabilization and security sector reform projects in Lebanon and in Jordan. And I think that the challenges that you have in those two countries are quite not universal, but very similar to across the space. Of course, they're very own special cases. But I suppose if I were to give some advice to any governments who are seeking to effect change, whether it be the United States or European Union member states, is to look at the coherence of their country portfolios. So Hicham at the beginning, and I think Bob as well, was talking about the different types of security assistance, which is a very broad umbrella. You've got the commercial relationships, selling weapons, etc., and training programs. Then you have the capacity building, which is basically capacitating the system to work better, but in the same way. And then you have the more transformational stuff, which is about governance, which is about transforming security sectors so that they actually uphold the rule of law, uphold human rights standards, and are accountable to their people, accountable to the law, accountable to the strategic plan. So, any given donor state in the Middle East will have a combination of these three, but rarely are they examined together. So this calls into question the coherence of those country portfolios. Does the right hand know what the left hand is doing? And it does relate to the book, because the book is somewhat unique in that it combines analyses of each of these strands. And I think it would be naive to imagine that the United States or any European Union member state is just going into Iraq or Lebanon or Jordan or wherever it is to improve the accountability of the police forces. It's not just about that. It's about other geopolitical interests. And frankly, a lot of the time, it's about maintaining some sort of relationship, even with the most difficult regimes. But I think that you can end up with totally incoherent portfolios. And then at the very least, that's just a waste of your own population's tax dollars. So I think that having these relatively honest, open conversations about what is actually trying to be achieved is a good idea. And also to avoid window dressing, because you have a lot of schemes which are dressed up as security sector reform or security sector governance, but actually they're something completely different. And they have different aims. They're about capacity building, or they're about cementing relationships. And really, it just makes people cynical, both the recipients and the people who are supposed to be doing it. Because it says one thing on the tin, but when you pour it out, it's something completely different. So in sum, I think, take a sort of synthetic, make a synthesis of what you're trying to achieve in a country and see if it actually adds up. And that goes to the United States as well as donor states on my continent.
So let me pick up on this cynicism issue, because Lindsey's chapter, to my surprise, talked about a correlation between U.S. security assistance and support for democratization. There was sort of a level of confidence people had, it seems, that came from U.S. providing security assistance, providing confidence in democratization. Can you help us understand how that progressed, unfolded, and what it means?
Well, I think Lindsey's chapter is really fantastic. Is this a question for Lindsey?
That was a question for Lindsey, yeah.
Oh, so sorry. So yeah, best Lindsey should answer it, huh?
Thank you for the question.
Go
As Bob and Mullah Hicham mentioned, my chapter talks a little bit about this sort of tension between security assistance having a potential to improve governance, but being unlikely to democratize. So what I'm trying to do in this chapter is that I draw on literature showing the relationship between institutional support and support for democracy. And I use the Eurobarometer to explore the relationship between the perceived effectiveness of the military and demand for democracy. And here I find that while US security assistance strengthens authoritarianism, it also contributes to building institutional trust, which is an outcome that could support democratic consolidation in the future.
Does that strike you as surprising, ironic, contradictory? I mean, how it seems, as I've, for example, watched the revolution in Egypt in 2011, it seemed that the democracy call was for an end to military rule. The military was able to get on the right side of the public and maintain trust through the elections. But then the military also had the trust of the public when it removed a democratically elected leader and subverted a future democratic process to hold the Muslim Brotherhood accountable?
Well, in a way, it is hard to understand this outcome. But when we think about the region of the MENA and the level of insecurity that people are experiencing, we see sort of trends in the Arab barometer over time in which there's declining support for civilian institutions like the parliament, but increasing support for militaries. And we know theoretically that in order for citizens to have confidence that having freer elections is something that they desire, they have to have some level of confidence in government institutions. So we're in this situation, I believe, in the region in which there's low confidence in civilian institutions, higher confidence in the military, and conditions of relative insecurity or great insecurity. And so what the data seem to suggest, there are 7 countries in the analysis, but what the data seem to suggest are first that in those countries in which the military was involved in any way during protests during the Arab Spring, it's in these countries where citizens have higher confidence in their military. And this seems to be related to higher support for democracy. So this suggests that the militaries have positioned themselves well to gain in a situation in which there's growing instability. So first, there's a relationship between the involvement of the military in protests and then higher support for the military. And the second being in countries in which there's greater US security assistance and therefore a stronger military, you also see stronger overall levels of support for the military, including in places like Egypt. And this also seems to be correlated with support for democracy. So this leads us to this tension in which we don't think that having a stronger military is necessarily a democratizing factor, but in fact, it can help create some orientations within society that in the long term could be important for sustaining a democratic consolidation in the future.
So let me ask a question to Bob and Hicham. And that is, as you know, there are any number of calls in the United States to reduce US security assistance to the Middle East. What do you think people who are calling for that get right, and what do they get wrong?
As Bob said earlier, in the case of Egypt, it's a little bit, the train has a bit left the station, because if you look at the Gulf help that has been extended to the military, it's in the billions, really in the billions, and there is more pressure now. There is more pressure on the military on the part of the Gulf, not successful as of now, but to force the military to exit the economy intelligently and in an orderly way, and that pressure hurts on Egypt because the help is crucial. For more generally on the region, what the United States should do is qualify that demand and analyze it more deeply rather than present it more crudely. For example, there's an area in which there could be serious progress and in which it's not frontal vis-a-vis these militaries. It's not as threatening. It may be irritating, but not as threatening. For example, associating and involving civilians more in the disbursement, in the allocation, in the treatment of military assistance. And that is related, but it's not entirely about civilian military relations. It is more about rendering more civilians and building more state capacity where necessary in this in the military assistance framework, and that can go a long way to create rationalization, to create trade-offs that can be helpful in this relationship and get it's a stepping stone to farther to farther deepening the question. I think that's an area that should be explored.
John, if I could just throw in my 2 cents worth on this, you know, as soon as you finish a book and it goes to the publisher and the printer, you realize what's wrong with it. And so I have a confession in this regard that's pertinent to your question. And that is that this book is focused on security assistance, like many others. And there is another strain of literature which focuses on development assistance. The two streams, if you will, don't come together at all. I have never seen even an article, much less a book, that tries to sort of compare development assistance, meaning civilian assistance, to military assistance. And were you to do that, and who knows, maybe someday we'll regather our group of 17 and push forward, you would find they're remarkably similar in terms of their various shortcomings. And so the glib answer to your question is, if you were to pour tons of money into civilian assistance, into democratization assistance, for example, would you have a significantly different level of democracy in the recipient country or not? And I think the little bits of empirical research that have been done on that question are not encouraging. That is, your money doesn't buy votes and democracy any more than maybe your money buys a military that is both performing effectively and subordinate to civilian control. So there are real limits. It's not just military security assistance is much more criticized than is civilian assistance, which has a sort of halo around it, even though its effectiveness is quite limited. And in my mind, no more effective than is security assistance. So you got to ask the question in a way in a broader framework. How do you do assistance, whether civilian or military, more effectively to get outcomes you want? And that's the next project.
Although it seems to me that there's a difference between democracy and governance assistance, which has had a pretty checkered history, and things like health assistance, which I think has done tremendous things in a large number of countries in the Middle East. Hasn't always created robust bureaucracies to support it after the assistance goes away. But for example, in a place like Egypt, right, population assistance had a dramatic impact on Egyptian demographics. And when the USAID program ended, there was also a program, as you know, on maternal and child health. After the program ended, there was a problem reverting to the mean, partly because the U.S. aid process had drawn people out of the Egyptian bureaucracy to work for the aid implementing organizations, thereby making the Egyptian government itself less effective doing the things they were partnering to do.
Well, the similarity is with security assistance is interesting in this regard. So yes, in Egypt and in other countries receiving civilian assistance for programmatic purposes, health, education, and so on, you'll find you create little islands of excellence that do work well. And so birth control in some ways, some of the maternal health clinics, that sort of thing have worked very well in Egypt. And the increasing longevity rate attests in considerable measure to that, just like a lot of security assistance has ended up creating very effective military units. And so the SDF in northeastern Syria is a case in point. And some of the units within the Egyptian military, most notably their special forces unit, really acquit themselves very well. Now, however, on the civilian side of it, what the United States Agency for International Development has been unable to do in Egypt and virtually every other country in the Middle East where it operates is to really impact governmental policy. It has not built partner capacity, which is the term from security assistance, in the civilian sector any better than it's built it in the military sector. That government policy in Egypt, let's go back to that, with regard, say, to education, is appallingly bad. And the consequences are not good, despite the fact that you have some very high performing educational institutions in the country. But the policy problem it has not been addressed in the civilian sector or in the military sector. So I think, they do suffer from the same problems. And if your aspirations are to rebuild government policy, to influence it very profoundly, then I just don't know how much money you'd have to spend to do that, far more than the American taxpayer is willing to cough up.
Absolutely true. I have a couple more questions. Also, if you're watching online, you have a question for the panel. If you're watching on the CSIS website, go down to the button on the page that says ask a question. If you're watching on YouTube, put a question into the comments and it will get to me on a pad that's right next to me. There's been a lot of talk in the Biden administration about right-sizing the security assistance role and using more elements of statecraft, more development assistance, more economic trade, other kinds of partnerships. What's the unique value proposition of security assistance that nothing else can do? I mean, what's the core from a U.S. government bilateral relationship perspective, or arguably from a European government bilateral relationship perspective? What's the thing that only security assistance will get you, and what kind of security assistance gets that for you? And I welcome anybody's ideas on this.
Well, I wanted to say something very important previously to very, very quickly to Bob's remark and yours. Some programs do have success. The problem is when the nature of the closed access order of the regime of the state is touched, that's when you have a conflict. That's when you're going to have failures, and that's when you're going to have challenges. You're not going to have it so much in health, because it's important even for the regime, but when it comes to education, you're going to have it. When it comes to fostering critical thought, which is threatening through the regime, then it becomes a political economy question. And so I think that's an important that's an important proviso to introduce. Yeah. Concerning your latest question, what was it again? I'm sorry, very quickly, very quickly.
No, what's the unique value proposition of security assistance that even if you have a more well-rounded policy, you absolutely need security assistance to do? It gets you something that none of the other tools of statecraft can advance.
Well, the idea was before the Iraq intervention was the idea was, what can we do so that we don't get personally and we don't get involved, don't get on the front line? That what can we do so that someone else, we can defer or shift that task to someone else? And with the fiasco in Iraq, that essentially has put things back into perspective. I think the Ukrainian war now, the war in the Ukraine is another of those sobering moments, in which cases we see that there is a whole array of assistance that is needed to introduce efficiency, and namely, everything that has to do with drones, that has to do with hacking, that has to do with disinformation and so forth, which is an important dimension in military assistance. The problem with that is that if that becomes part of the package, that becomes a space of debate, then that further reinforces the autocratic tendencies of the regime. So that's a conundrum, and I'll let Bob follow up on that and pick it up in directions he thinks are important.
Well, John, the first word in security assistance is the principal objective. And in the absence of security, as Lindsey suggests in her chapter on public opinion, in the absence of security, people are frightened. And they then cower under whatever security umbrella they may find, whether it's a militia or the National Army or whatever it is. So the only thing that can provide security in a situation of threatened violence is a coercive agency. It's not going to be provided by Parliament. And so if you're dealing, as throughout the Middle East you are, in one of the most violent regions of the world, you are inherently having to take up the issue of how do we control the guns? How do we make it safe for people? And the Ukrainian case illustrates the importance of a joined up military. And paradoxically, Egypt does the same thing. So the Ukraine is invaded by Russia. And what has happened as a result of that is the Ukrainian military has become one of the most joined up militaries in the world. And it's worked extremely effectively as a result of that. It did so because it had security assistance and because it had the motivation to fight the Russians and to do it with every muscle in its national body. So in Egypt, if we could imagine that you did not have a competent, reasonably competent military now, and we have what's going on in the Sudan, and we have what's going on in Libya next door, and we have the increasing competition in the Red Sea, then the threat to the viability of Egypt as a nation state would be under question. We look what goes on in the Sinai, and while the counterterrorism campaign hasn't been hugely effective, it's prevented it from spilling into Egypt proper. So we may not like it, but guns are essential to security. And if you're going to just walk away from that, you're going to invite, infinitely greater problems and of a greater magnitude than the ones you can actually deal with improved security assistance rather than the abolition of it.
So let me ask Alex a question, because we've really been talking implicitly, almost exclusively, about the United States. And there's an obvious question, what's the European role? But there's also the question, it's not just the US and or Europe, there's also Russia and China. So can you help us understand both a broader European role, a specific European state role, and the fact that you have Russia and China, which are not going to bother with a lot of the niceties that this panel has been talking about for the last 45 minutes?
Well, of course, the Europeans have a much more intimate experience of the Middle East and North Africa being on their doorstep. We call it the Southern Neighborhood. This is the European Union parlance. And broadly speaking, you see these two strands at work. You see the capacity building and you see the sort of more transformational reform. Now, it's very difficult even to map actors such as the Europeans, who are generally very transparent in at least some of their programming. In addition, the United States is also like that to some degree too, although we don't know what we don't know. You're right, increasingly you will see sort of non-traditional aid actors, let's say, the Turks, the Qataris, and of course the Russians, getting involved in more sophisticated programs than just arming. And of course, Turkey, for instance, is a member of NATO. And so you can get glimpses of what Turkey is operating through that, but it's very difficult. And so overall, it's hard to sort of give a clear picture of how all these different powers contrast. I think, in general terms, the European Union, which is emerging, as a security actor and even as a defense actor in Ukraine, has in the past taken a sort of more reform transformation type approach with some significant exceptions. And to look at Ukraine, so Bob has brought this up, there are perishingly few good examples of very successful and widespread security sector reform in the Middle East. But something has happened in Ukraine. If you look at the difference between the performance of the security sector in 2015 or the defense sector in 2014 versus in 2022, the difference is staggering. And at least part of that story is reform around procurement and around the defense industry, which has really transformed the efficiency of the Ukrainian defense sector and its ability to project power. And perhaps we can look there for good examples of how it can be done in the Middle East. Of course, we can't abstract Ukraine from its geopolitical context, but it is very hopeful, even while the Ukrainians are facing a dreadful existential threat.
You're not suggesting that we need a good war to get the Middle East in the right space.
That sounds, yeah. You seem to be quoting either Marx or Andrew Prigozhin there, who have both very recent, well, not Marx, I suppose, both Andrew Prigozhin has, brought up this notion that, countries are experiments that are tested by the crisis of war. And it's sort of ironic because if it's a test, Ukraine is coming out quite well. But what I'm suggesting is that when it's possible to look at the example of Ukraine is going to be really fruitful for the Middle East.
Very interesting. Let's get to some audience questions. Eugene Rossetti asks, what steps should the U.S. take immediately to limit waste in security assistance? Is waste a problem? What should we do about it?
Well, one of them is to divide roles and responsibilities somewhat differently than they are presently divided between provider and recipient. And so at present, although some of the weaponry that's provided, which is in the inflation rate of key tools of war has outrun global inflation rates in any of the Western countries. So an F-16, for example, when we began the program in Egypt, cost something around 12 to 15 million. They're now costing approaching 100 million. Yes, the plane it has been improved, but the inflation rate, I think, by any measure, outruns the rate of improvement of performance. So for recipient countries to be focused on top-of-the-shelf weaponry, as most of, certainly as the Gulf states are, and even a country like Egypt is, then the cost burden is absolutely enormous for them. And it's not just the purchase price, it's the maintenance. And General Williams' chapter in our book goes into that to some extent, he being the man who initiated the F-16 program in Egypt, as a matter of fact, and oversaw it for years. And for him, the staggering cost of maintaining that program, to say nothing of the purchase, was something that really caused you to want to rethink how you do it. So if you divide the roles and responsibilities differently, they would be that the building partner capacity recipient would focus their efforts a little further down the technological military ladder, where they are better equipped to perform. It doesn't cost them as much. They're more in tune with the region. And in a sense, a model then for them becomes what the Iranians have done, because the Iranians have had a low-tech approach to their security assistance, whether in Lebanon or in Yemen or in Iraq, and they've done very well indeed. And so I'd say what you want to do is divide roles and responsibilities so that the high-tech jobs, if you will, are left pretty much to the Western security providers, and the lower-tech jobs are left to those in the region who are better equipped to perform them in any case. So I think that's one of the ways you can go about answering Eugene's question there.
Although, frankly, I was just at a meeting this morning with people from the defense industry, and what they were focused on was that we need the Gulf countries to buy the higher end kit, because that's what makes the weapons more affordable for the United States, because you have to have larger production lines and larger production runs, and it's actually the customers on the Gulf side that make it more affordable for Americans to buy the high-end kit. I think there's also the question, and your response sort of prompted it in my mind, to what extent are the Gulf supply desires shaping what other countries in the region want, expect, feel entitled to. I mean, to what extent is the fact that there are some customers in the region who can afford anything they want, make everybody want much higher end equipment? And, you know, the back end of that is, isn't it good to get people on high end equipment? Because as you said before, the maintenance, logistics, the training tail is huge. And actually, the higher the end equipment, the more you get countries lashed up with security future of the United States.
But you cannot. That's an economic analysis. But the reality is you can't separate it from the political component. Is that when they're put in a driver's seat, then they have the necessity to project their own power because of the own vision that they have of themselves in their own states. And then that neutralizes whatever optimization you have of military assistance, because then they become an independent component of a projection of power and of meddling in the region, of interference. And that's the story of the derailment of the Arab Spring. So whatever you can win in economic rationalization and in, if you will, in leveling off, you know, the costs and the benefits for everyone, but what good does it make when it basically has that such a toxic effect?
And the other part of it, the question, John, Mullah answered the first part. The second part is the Jones effect. What thy neighbor has, you shouldn't envy, but they do. So that envy effect has been fed by the Gulf states. After all, it was the Saudis it was the French taxpayer and the Saudis who paid for the 2 squadrons of Rafales that were bought from France. And the Saudis have paid. Egypt was the 5th largest purchaser of military equipment over the past several years in the world. This is a country that's verging on bankruptcy. And so its ability to purchase those weapons is in considerable measure thanks to various forms of economic support provided from different GCC states. So it's not just a question of envying thy neighbor, it's the fact that the neighbor has made that possible, and in a very counterproductive way. I mean, I don't think it's increased the military effectiveness of in this case, Egypt. And it has had a lot of downsides economically and as well as politically, as Hicham was just saying. So you're right to point to it. It is a very important question. And it's not one, as you learned this morning in your conversation with defense contractors, it's not an argument they like to hear. But if we're looking at national interests on both sides, principal and agent, then you got to say no to some of what the defense contractors want.
But on the other side, and I think it's an interesting side, and it fits into some of the discussion we were having about the overlaps between the security assistance and diplomacy and other things. It was Emirati envy of the Israelis getting the F-35 that had a lot to do with driving the Emiratis toward what are called the Abraham Accords, which may play a really productive role reducing tensions in the Middle East. So it seems to me that some of these things are, as you rightly say, extremely complicated with positive aspects and negative aspects, and rarely as simple as people would like to present them to be.
Well, educating the actual users of the equipment about it, I think, is a relatively important thing to do. And so your training programs are enormously important in this regard. And so the F-35 has extraordinary capacities, but it has extraordinary requirements as well. And if you're able to develop military-to-military relationships that are really effective, it seems to me you can then sort of dull the appetite of the political leadership in these countries, which is to say, well, see, they really trust us and value us because they're selling us the F-35. And it's not necessarily a military-driven thing. If you're going to elevate the capacity of the departments of defense in these various countries so they can really analyze their needs and act upon them, it seems to me you would probably address to some extent the problem you've identified.
We have a very interesting question from Cody Wallace from the UN Development Program, who says that all of the presentations have made clear the complexity of security assistance. How does your book take into consideration associated military welfare regimes and their impact / connectivity / embeddedness in society in the Arab states? Prime examples are Jordan, where a tremendous majority of society are either reliant directly or indirectly on pension, social security, and veteran institutions. Remedial benefits is a unique value proposition major providers and security assistance have in this militarized social welfare space. Interesting question.
Well, the answer, I didn't catch the questioner's name, but the answer is to be found in the
Cody
chapter.
Wallace.
Sorry?
Cody Wallace.
Cody, let me recommend, I can't remember the number of the chapter, but it's on Jordan, and it's by Sean Yom. And he addresses exactly that issue you're raising of the consequences of, if you will, military socialism.
And Bob, can you hold up the book again?
Yeah.
Right, so it's the chapter by Sean Yom, Security Assistance in the Middle East.
Yeah,
That's
that
the one you
goes
want.
directly at it. And as Cody states, not just implies, there are a lot of pernicious effects here. And it's precisely that is the focus of that chapter. So I shall just refer you to it and say no more.
Lindsey, I thought you wanted to come in on this.
Yes, thank you for that question. In the analysis of the Eurobarometer data, it's not surprising that those who work in the military or in the government are more supportive of the military. So we do see differences across groups in this regard. I wanted to just speak, following up on what Bob said about the value proposition of supporting security assistance. The Eurobarometer data is fairly clear that having a stronger military reduces feelings of insecurity, and this seems to be correlated with greater support for democracy. And if we look at various papers that ask this question, we see that support for democracy is not explained by religious orientations or other factors related to culture, but rather it's support for democracy is explained by feelings of greater security. So I don't think that we can put too fine a point on the notion that supporting security is very important for building societies where people feel comfortable having freer elections, and also supporting changes like the Abraham Accords, being willing to hold conciliatory views.
Okay, final question, and it's a tough one. It's from Danny Sharp, who asks, how does the perception that the United States is looking for the door in the Middle East affect its ability to accomplish its goals through security assistance?
Oh, that's a very hard question. But I think it aggravates the problem in a sense, because it forces many of these states to go for providers, and I guess well, let me do this. Let me say this. It gets us out of the military assistance paradigm and gets us into the procurement paradigm, and the suppliers become China and Russia and other regimes whose cooperation comes with other strings attached, and less about transparency, less about accountability. And it entangles the militaries even more into the internal politics of these regions. That's the short answer for me.
And John, if there's just one last moment for Danny's question, the analogy to President Biden may be appropriate here. President Biden, when asked if he's going to run again, basically answers it in the affirmative, or at least in the ambiguous. And so to sort of declare, as to some extent, Washington has done over the past several years, that it's looking for alternatives to engaging in the Middle East is to invite the sort of ambitious replacement that clearly is something that President Biden doesn't want from within the Democratic Party. And so you are creating a vacuum, whether you intend to or not. And so it does create a problem for security assistance, as Moulay is saying. It becomes simply an arms bazaar instead of the idea that, hey, these guys are going to be around, they're going to back us, they're going to develop our military and so on. So I think it's a bad idea to message that.
We have run out of time. I want to thank Moulay Hicham Alaoui, Bob Springborg, Lindsey Benstead, and Alex Walsh for participating in this really excellent discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your excellent book, which I hope that all of our viewers will buy. And we look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Thanks so much. Have a good day.